have this statement from the president announcing Israel and Hamas. He says, if, quote, both signed off on the first phase of our peace plan, all hostages will be released soon. Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed-upon line as the first steps towards a strong, durable, and everlasting peace. This is a brand new statement from the president. The background was this scene at the White House where Rubio handed Trump a note during a roundtable event, and it could be seen that it seemed to refer to a peace deal being very close. Hamas had recently previewed the possibility of accepting aspects of this.
Scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and to kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. That's an accurate description from the most respected Israeli source. The Oslo Accords 20 years ago established that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity whose integrity cannot be broken up. For 20 years, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separate Gaza and the West Bank in violation of the accords that they had accepted. And a look at the map explains why. Gaza offers the only access to the outside world of Palestine. If Gaza is separated from the West Bank, whatever autonomy might ultimately be granted in the West Bank would be imprisoned. Israel on one side, a hostile Jordan, ally of Israel on the other side, and in addition, one of Israel's slow and steady U.S.-backed policies is to take over the Jordan Valley, about a third of the West Bank, much of the arable land, which would essentially imprison the rest even more tightly if Gaza is separated from the West Bank. Now, that's the major geostrategic reason for the Israeli insistence with U.S. backing on separating the two in violation of the Oslo agreements and the series of ceasefires that have been reached since November 2005. Well, the November 2005 agreement lasted for a few weeks. In January 2006, a very important event took place, the first full free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw, came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. U.S. and Israel didn't want that. You may recall at that period, the slogan on everyone's lips was democracy promotion. The highest U.S. commitment in the world was democracy promotion. Here was a good test. Democracy. Election came out the wrong way. The U.S. instantly decided, along with Israel, to punish the Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way. A harsh siege was instituted, other punishments, violence increased. The United States immediately began to organize a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable government. That's quite familiar practice. I won't go through the record. The European Union, to its shame and discredit, went along with this. There was an immediate Israeli escalation. That was the end of the November agreement, followed by major Israeli onslaughts. In 2007, a year later, Hamas committed even a greater crime than winning a fair election. It preempted the planned military coup and took over the Gaza. That's described in the West, in the United States, most of the West, as Hamas's taking over Gaza by force, which is not false, but something is omitted. The force was preempting a planned military coup to overthrow the elected government. That was a serious crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To preempt a U.S. planned military coup is far more serious. The attack on Gaza increased substantially at that point, major Israeli onslaughts. Finally, in January 2008, another ceasefire was reached. Terms were pretty much the same as those that I quoted. Israel publicly rejected the ceasefire, said that it would not abide by it. Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, despite Israel's refusal to do so. That continued until November 4th, 2008. On November 4th, which was the day of the U.S. election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets attacking Israel, huge Israeli response, lots of killings, all Palestinians as usual. By the end of December, a couple of weeks later, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. The Israeli cabinet considered it, rejected it. This was a dovish cabinet led by Ehud Olmert, rejected it and decided to launch the next major military operation. That was Cast-led, which was a horrible operation, so much so that it caused a very substantial international reaction, investigations by the United Nations Commission, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. In the middle of this assault, the assault incidentally was carefully timed to end immediately before President Obama's inauguration. He had already been elected, but he wasn't inaugurated yet. So when he was asked to comment on the ongoing atrocities, he responded by saying that he couldn't do so. The United States has only one president, and he wasn't president yet. He was talking about lots of other things, but not this. The attack was timed to end immediately before the inauguration, so he therefore could respond to the questions by saying, well, now's not the time to look at the past, let's look forward to the future. Diplomats know very well that that's a standard slogan for those who are engaged in serious crime. Let's forget about the past, let's look forward to a glorious future. Well, that was right in the middle of the assault. The Security Council did pass a resolution unanimously, U.S. abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire with the usual terms. That was January 8th, 2009. It was never observed, and it broke down completely with the next major episode of mowing the lawn in November 2012. You can get a good sense of what was going on by looking at the casualty figures for the year 2012. 79 people were killed, 78 of them Palestinians. The usual story.
This is, not an accidental killing. This is not a journalist who happened to get caught in Israel's indiscriminate bombardment of Palestinian civilians in general. This was a targeted killing. Israel, admits that it went after Anas and says, because he was a member of Hamas's military unit. And frankly, that's what they always say. These kind of unsubstantiated unilateral accusations are worthless. And when you, couple that with the pattern of harassment of him, the obvious effort to silence him, it's clear what's going on.
It's undoubtedly a war crime, and this, of course, has been the deadliest conflict, genocide in history. There was a study a few months ago by Brown University in the US which compiled data on journalists killed, civil war in the US, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and all those journalists killed combined was still less than what Israel has done in Gaza since October 7.
In fact, we have decided, and I've ordered, directed the military to bring in foreign journalists, more foreign journalists, a lot. There's a problem of assuring security, but I think it can be done.
The October 7th attacks by Hamas and Israel's genocidal response have shaken several Middle Eastern countries to their foundations. That includes Israel itself, where the news media provide a window into a nation initially gripped by grief that then turned to revenge. That picture, however, has started to shift. At the liberal end of the Israeli spectrum, expressions of guilt, even anger over the onslaught in Gaza have been surfacing, with more and more Israeli voices using terms such as ethnic cleansing, even genocide, to describe it. And there is alarm over how Israel's devastation of Gaza may come home to roost, sparked by the news that Brazil launched an investigation into an Israeli soldier on holiday there for war crimes, and the implications that has for hundreds of other soldiers who have incriminated themselves on social media, which is why 46,000 Palestinian lives later, the Israeli army has now taken extraordinary steps when it comes to both the mainstream media and social media to stop showing the faces of its homegrown war criminals. 4 interviews on the genocide Israel continues to inflict on Palestinians in Gaza. 2 from Israel, done over Zoom, since Al Jazeera has been banned there. 1 from the US, and 1 with a Palestinian human rights researcher in central Gaza. What is left of it?
We're talking about 80% of the population that even if they were allowed to go to their homes, they will not actually find homes. They will live on the rubble. This suffering will continue for decades, not just years, decades.
Despite all the evidence, much of it posted by its own soldiers on social media, Israel still insists it's not committing war crimes, let alone a genocide. But more and more countries see past the propaganda. Like Brazil, where a judge recently ordered that an Israeli soldier on holiday there be investigated for his role in Gaza. The Israelis got him out before charges could be laid. The case produced a panicky response in Israeli news studios because of its implications.
ארגנטינה, צ'ילה, ברזיל, מדינות שיש להם סמכות שיפוט אוניברסלית ומאוד קל להעמיד, וכמובן תאילנד, יעד פופולרי שמחפשים שם משרד עורכי דין, וזה כנראה ילך ויגבר, אבל...
Army chiefs then declared that from now on, the identities of Israeli soldiers will be hidden from the world, their faces blurred in interviews, plus a ban on soldiers posting their exploits on social media. It's too little, much too late. Soldiers have already provided mountains of online evidence for war crimes investigators, which, as a former Israeli Army Chief of Staff pointed out, is not the only evidence out there.
שיפסיקו להוציא החוצה כל מיני סרטונים וכל מיני אמירות, אבל זה לא יעזור להם, הפוליטיקאים ידברו על זה שבעצם אנחנו מתכוונים לדלל או לנקות האוכלוסייה, זה פשע מלחמה, אז לא?
The Israeli news outlet Ya'alon was speaking on. Ynet has since posted an online guide for Israeli soldiers on how to avoid arrest overseas and what to do if that happens.
This is a video recovered from a Palestinian paramedic whose body was discovered in a shallow grave in Rafah, southern Gaza. He's one of 15 bodies found. It's March the 23rd, and a convoy of paramedics from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, civil defense teams, and a UN employee are responding to a plea for help. Their vehicles are marked. Their emergency lights are clearly visible. When the convoy stops, Israeli soldiers open fire for minutes on end. In the paramedic's last moments, he's praying.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله الله أكبر.
Eventually, his voice begins to fade. For a week, no one knew what had happened to these medical workers.
Just going to check to see if there's any human remains in here.
After eventually getting Israeli approval, the UN moved into the area and made this discovery.
One of the victims' bodies received more than 20 bullets. Others were handcuffed and buried. Others were killed inside their ambulance but later found in a mass grave. This proves that the Israeli soldiers deliberately assassinated the relief and medical staff, then intentionally pulled their bodies from inside the ambulance vehicles and buried them all in a mass grave.
Before the video came to light, Israel didn't deny the shooting, but said the vehicles were moving suspiciously towards their soldiers with their lights off, which the video now clearly contradicts. The UN is demanding an independent investigation.
I'm appalled by the recent killings of 15 medical personnel and humanitarian aid workers, which raise further concerns over the commission of war crimes by the Israeli military.
In a statement, Hamas says the footage captures the deliberate, cold-blooded slaughter of clearly marked ambulances and civil defense teams with flashing emergency lights as they performed life-saving duties. Despite the grave risks, these paramedics answered a call to save lives, only to be murdered in the process. Mike Lappel, Al Jazeera.
What we know is that Gaza medical authorities are telling us that an Israeli airstrike has killed 4 international aid workers with the World Central Kitchen charity as well as their Palestinian driver. They've said that they were helping deliver food and other supplies in northern Gaza that had just arrived hours earlier by ship from Cyprus. Now, there has been footage and images posted to social media showing the bodies of the alleged 5 killed at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in northern Gaza. Now, several of them were wearing protective gear in the vision, showing the charity's logo and the nationalities there were passports shown by staff in those videos, showing 3 of the passports showing a British, Australian and Polish passport, but the nationality of that 4th worker is still not known.
Okay, and what has the response been?
Yeah, well, just in the past 30 minutes, we've received a bunch of responses, particularly from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We asked if they have any more information to provide. They said they're urgently seeking to verify and confirm those reports. They said the reports are distressing and that they've been clear that they expect humanitarian workers in Gaza to have a safe and impeded access to do it.
The report has called the Israeli strike, which killed Australian aid worker Zomi Frankham in Gaza, a grave mistake. The IDF was found to have violated its own rules of engagement in a series of catastrophic errors when it fired upon the humanitarian convoy.
Zomi Frankham and 6 other aid workers died in a precision Israeli strike, despite their charity's branding obvious from above. This happens in war, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said at the time, but former Australian Defence Chief Mark Binskin, who was dispatched to investigate, today listed a litany of failures by the Israeli Defence Forces.
Errors in IDF decision-making, breakdown in situational awareness, confirmation bias, and a failure to comply with the intent of senior command direction.
This is unfortunately not an isolated incident.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong demanding Israel drastically improve its protection of aid workers.
The human suffering in Gaza is unacceptable and the war must end.
Zomi Frankum's family said the Binskin report was an important first step. We hope it'll be followed by further investigations and appropriate action. Peter Dutton, who this week visited the scenes of the October 7 massacre in Israel, said the report wasn't necessary, given the IDF had already admitted making mistakes.
We're getting into يعني الظلام دام شوي ولكن
من اللحظة الأولى كانت تبدو وكأن هذه حرب مختلفة تماما. في هذه الحرب لا مكان آمن ولا شارع آمن ولا مستشفى آمن. كان الكل مستهدف وكان الكل مع الأسف نازح بما فيهم الصحفيون.
This was the targeting and the killing of journalists at an unprecedented level that we hadn't seen before.
آنس الشريف ناشط الجناح العسكري لحماس.
They are trying to paint Palestinian journalists as not journalists at all in order to be able to kill them.
Al Jazeera journalist Anas al-Sharif has just been killed in what appears to be a targeted Israeli strike.
If you know that you can get away with murder, you will do it again and again and again.
Last year at this time, on the first anniversary of the October 7th attacks and 1 year into Israel's genocidal response, we focused on its systematic targeting of Gaza's hospitals and medical care and how that story had been reported. On this, the second anniversary of October 7th, we're examining the Netanyahu government's annihilation of another institution, journalism, how it has massacred Palestinian media workers at such a shocking rate, one the world has never seen before. According to one NGO, the Committee to Protect Journalists, in the first 10 weeks post-October 7th, Israel had already killed more media workers in Gaza than had ever been killed in a single year anywhere. Having locked the international media out of Gaza, the Israelis clearly had a plan to silence journalists inside the Strip, in many cases permanently, to keep news and information from coming out. And Palestinians saw it coming. All the signs were there from the start.
After October 7, you had Israeli parliamentarians, including the Foreign Ministry, and then amplified by Israeli media, suggest that Palestinian journalists in Gaza somehow had prior knowledge about the October 7 attacks, or that they were working for Hamas.
In Gaza, not all people who present themselves as being journalists are indeed journalists. Many of them are Hamas and Islamic Jihad members. Very
much part of the broader frame that the Israeli government has tried so hard to push over the last almost 2 years. Okay, so if there are no innocents in Gaza, then of course, by definition, Palestinians operating as journalists in Gaza are also not innocent.
They have always tried to discredit, to obfuscate, to claim that this is not real journalism, that they're biased, that in fact these aren't even journalists. Coverage by Palestinian journalists has always been viewed by Israel as a threat, because what Israel commits in Gaza, with the Scorched Earth campaign, with relentless airstrikes, with the demolition of entire cities and towns, if this coverage gets out, it's impossible to refute.
حتى الكاميرات تعجز عن توثيق هذه المشاهد والصور
and sometimes deliberate disinformation has been used by official spokespersons.
I'm sorry to be graphic here, but I can't see a baby here. If you can activate people's sense of disgust, they're more likely to support dire retribution against Palestinians.
It reveals some of the victims were killed by Israeli forces.
This footage I find very disturbing. We don't know who those individuals are. Gunmen, civilians, or hostages.
and it finds that October 7 may have changed the politics of the region forever.
I regret to say that I think it was a phenomenal success from their point of view.
October 7th has sent a very strong and clear message. No one can bypass the Palestinians.
In Palestine, there exist many thriving communities built by refugees who have already found a home there.
The Israeli settlements, known as kibbutzim, that surround the Gaza Strip were built around the time of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948.
The immediate area around Gaza is mostly small villages, kibbutzim. In the early years, at least, kibbutzim and other villages had a defense role. And the idea was wherever you established a kibbutz like this, I mean, that would determine Israel's border. That would hold the border.
Today, the kibbutzim are prosperous farming communities.
חבל הארץ הזה התפתח מאוד מאוד יפה, מספק חלק ניכר מהתוצר החקלאי של מדינת ישראל, לאוכלוסייה מגוונת.
And it's hugely concerning that these revelations have been virtually entirely ignored by the Western press. What's extraordinary is the Israelis were aware of the plans. Hamas were actually training quite openly for this operation, and they were actually placing the training videos online so anyone could view them. On the very night of October the 7th, before dawn, spotters along the fence are reporting back to headquarters, and the head of Shin Bet and the head of military intelligence take this seriously enough that in the middle of the night they're up and talking to each other, and they conclude it's just another training exercise. And what is extraordinary is that they don't even raise the alert level to number one. You know, the most basic alert level would have made a huge difference. And they don't do that, which means that when Hamas bursts through the fence at 6:30 in the morning, they catch many of the defenders in their beds. I mean, you can see many of the soldiers are killed in their beds. Hamas had anticipated most of their fighters would be killed trying to get through the fence. In fact, only a small number were killed trying to get through the fence. They were as much taken by surprise as anyone by the performance of Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military. Crucially also, they were taken by surprise by this very large music festival that was taking place, which they don't seem to have been aware of. Having overrun the military bases, the game plan was to grab hostages and take them back. And they do this on a large scale, but they also clearly kill very large numbers of unarmed civilians as well. The Israelis were then extraordinarily slow to respond. Now, they scramble Apache helicopters, but there's no ground control. It's pretty clear that in the chaos, some hostages at least were hit by Apache helicopter fire. We've identified 27 people who were clearly taken hostage, taken captive, and were taken away from their homes, but never made it to the fence, died somewhere between their homes and the fence. There's a fair chance that a number of them were killed by Apache helicopters. Within the kibbutzes, we've identified 18 people who were pretty much certainly killed by the police and the army as they arrived. 12 of them a specific incident in kibbutz Beri, where you have a large number of gunmen, around 40 gunmen, holed up in a house with 13 hostages. A tank is brought in and opens fire on the house. There are 2 survivors from this incident, which is why we know about it. There may be other incidents we don't know about because everyone was killed, but there are 2 survivors from this who spoke to Israeli media. There's a common sense thing. You just have to look at the scale of the destruction, and it's clear that 1,200 men armed with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns did not do all of this. The Hannibal Directive, which was something that was developed in the 1980s by the Israelis, and it was basically to avoid situations where their enemies would capture 1 or 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers and then effectively hold them to ransom. There was one occasion where the Israelis released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in return for a single Israeli soldier. So an order was issued whereby they said, it's better that we kill everyone than allow people to be captured. Now, this was supposedly rescinded several years ago, but at midday on October the 7th, the army revived the Hannibal Directive, put it into effect. 70 vehicles were hit. At least in some of the cases, everyone in the vehicle was killed.
The Israeli military does not deny the report.
The peculiarity of the days after October 7 is that the Israeli media and subsequently the international media choose to focus not on the very real and extensive crimes that Hamas and others did commit, but on crimes they did not commit. And this had two focuses. In the days immediately after, it's to do with babies. The most dramatic one is we see an allegation that there were 40 babies killed, many of them beheaded. This is very simple to deal with because we have a comprehensive list of the dead. We know that 2 babies are killed on October the 7th. One is an 10-month-old child who is hit by a bullet fired through a safe room door. The other is a child who dies after an emergency cesarean, a Bedouin child, in fact. Now, any story about babies that does not relate to those 2, and there are a lot of stories about babies, is not true. We know it's not true. This has enormous implications for the other wave of atrocity stories that began very quickly, which is to do with sexual violence, and particularly the Israeli assertion that it was widespread and systematic. To be clear, in the film, we are not saying that there were no rapes on October the 7th. We simply don't know. What we are saying is that there simply is not the evidence. There's not the forensic evidence, there's not the visual evidence, there's not the photographic evidence, and there is not the witness evidence to support the allegation of widespread and systematic rape. The Israelis have this strange system where they farm out the collection of bodies after disasters and terrorist attacks and so on to an organization called Zaka, who are ultra-Orthodox religious volunteers. They collect the bodies, prepare them for religious burial and so on. A character that many people will have seen in the days afterwards is Yossi Landau, who was the southern commander of Zaka, who was on television a great deal. He said,
"The 2 piles of 10 children each were tied to the back, burned to death."
You then see a phone call which Netanyahu makes to President Biden, where he repeats this story. In fact, he embellishes it.
They took dozens of children, bound them up, burned them, and executed them.
Terribly important, this, because it was entirely untrue. We know the house he's talking about. He's talking about the house in Kibbutz Be'eri, which was the house that was stormed by Israeli police and military, and where it is almost certain that all of the hostages were killed by the Israeli police and military. There were 2 children there, 2 twins, but no other children, so we know the story is untrue. Mr. Landau told a number of other stories. There's one particularly notorious one about the fetus being cut out of a pregnant woman.
The baby that was connected to the cord was stabbed, and she was shot in the back.
We simply know this is untrue. The list of the dead show there's no such victim. Mr. Landau said, I have a picture of this atrocity.
If you want to see the picture, I have the picture of it. This is the baby.
I'm sorry to be graphic here, but I can't see a baby here.
You can't see the baby but this is the picture of the mother.
It was a piece of charred flesh. It wasn't a baby. It certainly wasn't a baby. So it was interesting. Psychologically, I'm not quite sure why he offered to show me a photo that he didn't have. I'd point out as well that Zaka was an organization that was in trouble. There had been a major scandal. Its founder had been accused of child sexual abuse. There was a financial scandal. It had been found to be cooking the books. It's raised an awful lot of money since October the 7th. These stories were clearly useful, and they were useful to the Israeli government. In the film, we see Benjamin Netanyahu visiting Zaka volunteers and thanking them for talking to the world's media and stressing that this is another front in the war.
מנהיגים וגם לדעת הקהל. ויש לכם חלק חשוב בהשפעה על דעת הקהל שמשפיע גם על מנהיגים.
Why does this matter? Why does it matter whether this type of atrocity was committed, but not that type? People were killed in this way, not that way. It matters because the murder of babies and widespread rape has a particular resonance. It's particularly triggering. The Israeli government and its supporters, when they justify the brutality of the subsequent bombardment and invasion of the Gaza Strip, again and again and again, what they always reference is babies and rape.
If this describes you, you might qualify for up to $3,800 every month. That's because you could have a
and rape.
Young girls who were raped and then murdered.
Women brutally raped and murdered.
Little kids who are beheaded.
Pictures of terrorists beheading children.
These bastards put these babies in an oven and put on their oven. We found the kid a few hours later.
This is something you see in previous conflicts as well. If you want to dehumanize an enemy, if you want to desensitize people to the suffering that is inflicted on that enemy, then you portray them as barbarians. basically as savages, as people who are not deserving of humane treatment. And that's why it's relevant. That's why it's important to pick apart. A lot of the world's leading media outlets have done in-depth investigations where they have concluded there was widespread, systematic, instrumentalized, weaponized rape. The New York Times makes a particular feature of the story of a young woman. She was killed early in the morning 9 miles north of the music festival site as she and her husband were fleeing. The New York Times, in its big December investigation into sexual violence, leads with this, and about a third of the article consists of her story. And it's immediately undermined because the woman's sister then posts on Instagram immediately afterwards, this isn't true, we know she wasn't raped. She was texting us until minutes before her death. It's also the case that her husband had a lengthy phone conversation immediately after her death with his brother, and again, made no mention of rape. So it's very important that, because it's the central, most compelling piece of information in one of the biggest investigations done by one of the world's most prestigious media outlets, the New York Times, and it turns out not to be true. It's done by 3 journalists. One of them turns out to be somebody who worked in some capacity for Israeli intelligence previously, who has virtually no journalistic experience, and who had liked genocidal media posts. It's very interesting with Anna Schwartz. She gives an interview in Hebrew to an Israeli channel. She actually lays out how difficult they were finding it to find evidence that they were talking to all the hospitals and all the psychiatric clinics and so on, and that there was simply no evidence at all. There were no witnesses had come forward, no victims had come forward at all. I think she's telling this as if to show what digging they had to do, but it's actually very revealing. In the end, it's quite clear they fall back on the same sources as everyone else: Israeli government officials, IDF officers, and first responders, all sources which were discredited by the baby stories. So no babies were beheaded, no babies were thrown into ovens, and there is no real evidence for widespread and systematic rape. Now, it's very clear why the Israelis might want these stories to circulate. What's less clear is why very reputable Western news and media outlets should swallow them so uncritically, particularly given the track record of the Israeli government and the IDF, which has been shown again and again and again in the past to have been less than truthful in the accounts it gives.
Because our war is against Hamas, not against the people of Gaza. While this mission is urgent, we will continue to fulfill it with care and with a commitment to the sanctity of life, both Israeli and Palestinian.
The response to our film, October the 7th, has been interesting. The response is not to criticize and to pick apart and say we've got it wrong. They don't do that at all. What they do is they simply ignore you, which on one level I take as a compliment, because I think there are all sorts of people out there who would very much like to pick apart what we're doing and to destroy it and discredit it. And I think they take one look at it and decide they can't really do it. So what they do, which in a way is even more damaging, is just to entirely ignore us. This is significant because so often what we are doing is critiquing the way the mainstream media has covered the story, which may well be, of course, precisely why the media doesn't want to look at what we've done. So in a way, the treatment of this in many ways echoes the treatment of our earlier series, The Labour Files, which offered a critique of the dominant media narrative about Corbyn and the Corbyn years on the anti-Semitism crisis. The allegation of anti-Semitism clearly is a very powerful weapon that can be wielded in defense of the Israeli state. I think sometimes, particularly by the Israeli state, it is wielded very cynically and very deliberately.
When the ICC investigates Israel for fake war crimes, this is pure anti-Semitism.
It's not the case in Western media and Western societies that you cannot criticize Israel. You can. Now, you have to be a bit careful about how you do it, but certainly at the moment, during the assault on Gaza, you certainly can. What you cannot do is to question the fundamental philosophy of Zionism. What you are not allowed to do is to say what all Palestinians would say: Israel is a state whose defining feature is and has always been that it is structured to ensure the domination of one ethnicity over another, that it is in effect an apartheid state, which is what all of the world's human rights organizations now describe it as. The enormous peculiarity and dysfunction of Western media with Israel is not only does it not say that, you're actually not allowed to say that. And this renders criticism of Israel perilous terrain. People are very on edge. They're very aware that they're straying into dangerous territory. They're very aware they have to choose their words terribly carefully, otherwise they will be misconstrued. You can see this happening at its worst within the Labour Party, where particularly Jewish people are far, far more likely to be suspended and expelled for anti-Semitism from the Labour Party than non-Jewish people. But there is something more fundamental that goes on, which regards the Palestinian. Particularly Jewish people are far, far more likely to be suspended and expelled for anti-Semitism from the Labour Party than non-Jewish people. But there is something more fundamental that